romance, love, social convention, gender roles, and religion. Charlotte Bronte's most famous novel challenges ideas on all these topics, and we are here to discuss it. I'm Charlene.
And I'm Mike.
And this is Jane Eyre Files. Chapter 38. Reader, I Married Him. Hello, husband.
Hello, apple of my eye.
Thank you.
You know, I was actually thinking about just saying hello, wife, before I read the chapter. I'm like, let's just wrap it up with the basic. But I'm like, ooh, apple of my eye is a good line. I did like that. This is it?
This is the last chapter of Jane Eyre. Yeah. We're finally here.
When we started this podcast last year, you know, we knew we were going to come to this day. Yes. But yeah, now it's here. It's a little bit.
Seems like it came really fast, actually.
Somewhat, yeah. Because I think we planned it out. We said, okay, it's 38 chapters. If we do it this week, we'll be done by next summer. Of course, we bought a house in the middle of that and took a little bit of a break. But now it's over.
It's time to unpack chapter 38.
Yeah, so let's do the SparkNotes summary of the final chapter of the book.
Jane and Rochester marry with no witnesses other than the parson and the church clerk. Jane writes to her cousins with the news. St. John never acknowledges what has happened, but Mary and Diana write back with their good wishes. Jane visits Adele at her school and finds her unhappy. Remembering her own childhood experience, Jane moves Adele to a more congenial school, and Adele grows up to be a very pleasant and mild-mannered young woman.
Jane writes that she is narrating her story after 10 years of marriage to Rochester, which she describes as inexpressibly blissful. They live as equals, and she helps him to cope with his blindness. After 2 years, Rochester begins to regain his vision in one eye, and when their first child, a boy, is born, Rochester is able to see the baby. Jane writes that Diana and Mary have both found husbands and that St. John went to India as he had planned. She notes that in his last letter, St. John claimed to have had a premonition of his own approaching death. She does not believe that she will hear from St. John again, but she does not grieve for him, saying that he has fulfilled his promise and done God's work. She closes her book with a quote from his letter in which he begs the Lord Jesus to come for him quickly.
Now, the first line of this chapter is one of the most famous quotes from this book.
Oh, yeah.
Reader, I married him, because I think the simplicity in which Jane expresses her agency and independent choice is just beautiful, you know? The line isn't, reader, he married me, or reader, we were married, but reader, I married him. Jane has made this choice to marry Rochester on her own terms.
On her own, yeah. And I was thinking, like, you know, it does seem like she tends to use the active voice in this book, right?
Yes.
You know, and it's all told in first person. So I can see her, you know, wanting to conclude the story with a decision that was entirely hers. You know, especially since it's like, doesn't it seem like so many of the events in this book are out of her control?
Definitely, yeah. So now, you know, you really feel that she has the power and independence that she wanted from the beginning. When she was just a little girl sitting in the window nook reading and wanting some peace and quiet, and nobody was going to leave her alone. Now she can finally do what she wants to do.
Yeah, and I like that, you know, you mentioned, when you hear that expression, reader, I married him. You'll see it dropped in. I'll see it on Twitter. Somebody will, you know, people will just
cultural references.
Yeah, people will make cultural references to this, and it strikes me as interesting that, like, of all the stuff from Jane Eyre, that seems to be right. That seems to be the one.
It has persisted. It's interesting. I guess it's just, you know, after everything you've read through these chapters, everything that's happened to Jane, again, it's just so satisfying.
Oh, absolutely. It was hard. Like I said, this whole chapter, it was a little bit hard. We're going to get into it definitely about the parallels between these characters and us sometimes, but I felt like it was hard for me to read this chapter without getting emotional because it is a very satisfying conclusion. Like you said, it's a sweeping epic, you know, and it kind of goes through all these different ways, and you find yourself, like I said, kind of drawn to these characters, and like I said, but how do you wrap it up, right? It's a very short chapter. It's only 4 pages, right?
Yes.
And I found myself I was rereading passages after I had just read them. And then I think after I finished the chapter, I went back and reread it again just to kind of soak it in one more time.
All right. Because Jane really kind of wraps up all the loose ends in her narrative. So we find out what happened to all the characters. Again, it's very satisfying that we get to know what happens to them. because we find out that Diana and Mary are happily married to men who are worthy of them.
Yeah. I mean, that seems to be, of all the characters, that seems to be the most expected. Like the Rivers girls, they seem to carry themselves with dignity, but without pretentiousness.
Yes.
So I'm sure they would have both been quite a catch.
Yes.
So I'm glad to see that they would have wound up with people that were befitting them. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's good that Jane kind of celebrates that. And, perhaps not surprising, St. John just totally ignores Jane's news about her marriage and disregards the emotions that Jane must have expressed to him about this. But I do wonder how much detail she went into explaining what happened, what happened to Bertha, kind of, because she knows that he probably has a lot of thoughts about it. Does she feel like she has to justify herself to him?
I mean, that's classic St. John right there. And I was going to ask you the question, do you think he's bitter or do you think he's worried that Jane will stray from the path of God?
Well, I probably just the simplest answer would be that St. John just cares about her well-being and that she is, again, like you said, she is close to God and following his will. But part of me does think that St. John is a little bitter. And just because of the fact that he didn't even acknowledge it, that he didn't say, congratulations, I'm so glad you're happy, and then move on. He didn't have to say much, but maybe a little bitter, not because he wanted her for himself, but more that she didn't follow what he said she should do or something like that.
Yeah, and it's a shame because it seems like it does kind of put a little bit of a rift between the two of them.
Yeah,
just
it
because,
feels
like
sad.
I said, because she's only got so much family. I think they even mentioned in this chapter about how like Diana and Mary still come and visit, and we go visit them.
Yeah,
it's nice that she's finally got some sort of routine in her life, and she has people that she can go visit. It's a small group.
Yes.
But, I don't know if she's going to be visiting Mrs. Fairfax or any of the other, the employees from Thornfield, but at least...
No, that's true.
Yeah, she does have the Rivers sisters if she doesn't have the brother, Maybe,
Yeah.
Maybe she would get a letter out of the blue, but it sounds like she's, expecting it to not be the most uplifting letter.
Good news from St. John. But also, we get another update on someone we might have forgotten about. Little Adele.
Oh, yes.
And we find that Jane checks on her and puts her into a better school situation, which I think beautifully recalls Jane's experience at Lowood and how Jane just does not want that to happen to Adele. So Jane uses her power and influence as an independent woman to do some good for her.
Oh, for sure. It seems like throughout her life, Jane seems to always be connected to education. Mm-hmm. She knew its importance from a very young age.
Right.
It's wonderful to see her act in this manner, where she's acting in Adele's best interest.
Yeah.
And, I'm sure she doesn't want to be her governess again, and probably would appreciate the time alone with Rochester. So finding like a suitable school, she mentioned that it's nearby, right?
Yeah. So she can go check on Adele.
Yeah. So I'm sure that was kind of desirable in that situation where it's like, I don't want to be the one teaching you, but if I can keep you nearby, and that way another person who can come visit, or we can go visit her as well.
Yeah.
And then I was going to ask you, before we move on, one question I had was, do you think this chapter could have been longer? It does seem like Charlotte kind of wants to get through all the formalities and let the characters get on with their lives, but I was wondering why she didn't kind of dwell, considering how so much there's that word again, vivid. Mm-hmm. This book is very vividly detailed and described when she goes places, but it's like this one, she's just like, all right, we married, here's what happened to everybody else, peace.
It does seem that the marriage is like a finale, it's an end point. So it's like if you wanted to learn more about, let's say, Jane's married life, or include a scene where Diana and Mary visit them or something, that's something that comes in a later kind of story. I feel like this chapter is just Charlotte's chance to wrap up the story. The main dramatic arc is finished. So I feel like it's a natural ending.
Oh, yeah, for sure. I mean, it makes me wonder if could there be a sequel?
Could Charlotte have written a sequel? That would have been amazing.
Yeah. Maybe Charlene DeKalb can write the sequel.
I mean, there have been many authors that have written.
They?
Yeah.
Okay.
So yes, there's definitely a lot of options if people felt like they wanted to read more, see what their married life was like. We also get from Jane that her and Rochester have been married for 10 years and are still extremely happy. And their union and concord, I think, makes everything they both went through worth it. So I think it's interesting that Jane and Charlotte, they give us this time frame of 10 years. So the reader has a better understanding of how Jane is viewing her life story, that she's, viewing it from a considerable time distance. And she grew a lot throughout the events of the book, but the reader's happy to know that she is a happily married mother at only 28 or 29 and settled down. No more drama in her life.
Oh, yeah. I think it's kind of smart for Charlotte to have staged it this way. Everyone seems to have a better perspective on their life choices as the years go by, And it makes me wonder if Jane was more forgiving of those people in her life that wronged her, now that she's truly happy. Because I think, now that I think back about the events of this book, it seems like a lot of Jane's recollections, they just simply recall like what she said and in what context they were said at the time. Like she doesn't have any kind of retrospective commentary. There's a few times where she breaks that fourth wall and says, reader, I did this and that.
Yeah.
But, for all we know, we talk about it all the time. Sometimes adults know what's best. Sometimes there's moments when, you're stubborn and then you realize later, that person knew what they were doing. I'm not sure if he's going to forgive the Reeds or Mr. Brocklehurst, but she doesn't seem like she's not as critical as you think, right?
I think she keeps, like, especially for the childhood portion, she keeps in that child mentality pretty well.
Yeah.
And she remembers, I guess so clearly what she felt, as those events were occurring to her as a child. So, it was nice that for the most part, Jane really keeps us sort of immediately in the action of the story. So we feel like we're in it with her.
Okay. Yeah. But what the point I was getting at was more like, it seems, maybe I'm totally wrong. You know this book a lot better than I do. But when she's describing all these things that happened to her, she never really goes in to say like, I was upset about this, or this is how I felt about this. She's basically telling you, it's very black and white. This is what happened. And then this is what happened, And so I feel like because she's telling this story from 10 years later, perhaps she has had a moment to kind of realize, okay, if I would have described this event to you as it happened, I might have been more hysterical or something like that. Whereas she's like, okay, I've had time to think back. I'm now truly happy. I can just be like, okay, this is what happened at the school. This is what happened with the Reeds.
Oh, I don't know. I felt like there's a lot of emotion connected to some of the things that happened to her, where, the way that she reacts to Mrs. Reed, and she tells a story of how she kind of talks back to her for the first time and then what that felt like afterwards. And then also with Helen, dying and how that felt. I think that she does kind of still gives you all the emotions that she's feeling. Maybe tempered a little bit by looking past, looking at it through the lens of the past. But
of time, yeah.
Mrs. Reed, I feel like might be the biggest example of how she kind of is a little bit more understanding towards her.
Doesn't it seem like, It's what happens when you read a book over a year instead of just, I'm sure you probably read this book in about 3 days the first time you read it. So, yeah.
Well, pretty close. No. So we also get good news for Rochester because he partially gains back his sight. And they have one child, a son, which is great redemption for Rochester as God has tempered judgment with mercy. And he has everything he could have wanted, a loving wife, a family, and a degree of independence with his returning sight.
Yeah, I think I put that in my notes as well, that quote about being God tempering judgment with mercy, because like I said, he's paid for his errors and now he can enjoy the rest of his life, And although I wanted to ask you, the announcement of their child is done in a very, very odd way. It's kind of almost an afterthought.
Oh, you think so?
It's funny because to go through all the pageantry of, reader, I married him, and not have a, reader, I had a baby.
Yeah. What's the baby's name? And
yeah, that was a bit of a surprise, I mean, at the same time, it's cleverly written by Charlotte, the way she says, oh, and when his firstborn arrived, you could see it. But it just like, did you ever wonder about that all this time that you've been reading this book, that their child is referenced in 2 sentences? 2 sentences.
I don't think I've ever really thought about it. I guess because I felt like that wasn't the focus. It was always more the romance and the fact that they're together. The baby's just, okay, that's fine. I also feel like Charlotte, since she was a governess and she taught children, she didn't really care for kids sometimes. So
is that what it is?
Yeah. So I don't, and I think
I had my own. And it's just like, whatever. I had one. I'm supposed to have one. I gotta.
Yeah, it was an obligation that I fulfilled, and now Rochester has his son, so that's great.
His heir, if you will, an heir that came from Jane, a Jane Eyre, if you will.
Jane's heir.
Jane's heir. Yeah. And then the book for 400 pages. It has a very bizarre ending, I think.
Yeah, it just ends with St. John's thoughts.
Yeah.
which I'm not, I would, it is a kind of a weird way to end Jane's story.
Yeah.
And it's something that I've always kind of wondered about, like trying to figure out in my head why Charlotte would do it that way.
Yeah, I mean, I was surprised because, I mean, to be honest with you, I don't really remember it from the first time I read it. I don't remember it
you
ending
just gloss
that way.
over it.
Yeah, I think about Reader, I Married Him. I think about the sight coming back and having the son, And the only thing I could think of was, do you think maybe Charlotte may have wanted the readers to realize their own higher purpose and know that, the end of this book is kind of like the end of life. Like it's just a beginning in some way, I guess. And you can go on to the next phase.
Well, I think that's a very nice way of putting it. Yeah. I have my own thoughts, that, despite Jane's issues with living only for God and religion, St. John gets the last word. But his last quote, "My master," he says, "has forewarned me. Daily he announces more distinctly, surely I come quickly, and hourly I more eagerly respond. Amen, even so, come Lord Jesus," which is the last line of the book. I think it echoes Jane's cry to Rochester from across the moors, where she says, "I'm coming," I cried, "wait for me, oh, I will come." And that St. John is going to God just as Jane goes to Rochester. So Jane has found her heaven as St. John will find his.
Ooh, nice.
Right?
Nice.
I think that works out pretty well. But yeah, it is bittersweet to end like this. I think basically touching on St. John's death, but ultimately, I guess we should be happy that everyone is getting what they wanted.
Yeah, like I said, this was not traditional by any means, right? And I think I've said it before, but yet another reason why this book probably stood out a little bit. It didn't just have the traditional, okay, we lived happily ever after. I mean, they did, but it would have been so easy just to have the last sentence just be that. Instead, it's, hey, there's this missionary guy that's in India, and this is what he thought.
Right.
You know? And I'm still, we have a very weird relationship at this moment.
Yeah.
It's almost like he's giving a sermon, like he's wrapping up the sermon. Because Charlotte already said that St. John was this great orator, right? And so now she's like, okay, I'll go ahead and defer the last word to him. Because, Jane also seems very unbecoming sometimes and doesn't want to speak up, doesn't want to draw attention to herself. Yes. And so I guess it is befitting.
Keeps her thoughts to herself.
Yeah, I guess it is befitting that the last line in the book goes to the person that's known for being able to be boisterous and guide people in their lives. And
interesting point.
I don't know. I mean, I'm just grabbing at straws with you, but that's,
Well, if any of the listeners want to reach out to us on Instagram at AirGuide and let me know what you think, what kind of meaning you get from St. John having the last word of this book, I'd be interested to hear your thoughts. But we're coming to the close of this episode, and we usually end with meaningful passages or quotes. So, Mike, could you please share your meaningful passage?
Now, of course, you mean meaningful passage or quote after Reader, I Married Him.
Yes. I mean, it's too easy to pick that.
I mean, because when I originally started reading the chapter, I'm like, okay, I'm just going to, if I can't think of anything else.
You got that first line.
I'm going Reader, I Married Him, and I'm good. But I did, this line actually, I'll tell you right now, Shelly, this line made me choke up a little bit. And this is when Jane is writing to Diana and Mary to explain to them what's going on and giving them an update on her life. And she says, Diana announced that she would just give me time to get over the honeymoon, and then she would come and see me. She had better not wait till then, Jane, said Mr. Rochester when I read her letter to him. If she does, she will be too late, for our honeymoon will shine our life long. Its beams will only fade over your grave or mine.
Romantic.
Yeah.
A little bit morbid.
Somewhat morbid, but very romantic. Mm-hmm. And I mean, morbid only in the sense that maybe people who are devout think about stuff like that.
That's true.
Maybe I'm not as religious, and
it's more acceptable back then.
Yeah, and I feel like Rochester is still just as incredibly romantic as he was in the previous chapter, and it goes back to some of those parallels that I draw to our marriage. Like we haven't mentioned it, but yeah, I think Jane says in the book that they got married. It was just the parson and the clerk, right? Mm-hmm. I'll let the listeners know that when Charlene and I got married, we got married at a courthouse.
Yeah, we had a simple wedding.
We had the clerk who processed the paperwork, then threw on a robe and performed the ceremony. But the amount of people that were there, it was my close friend Chad, my sister, and then your mother, father, grandmother, and sister. And that was it.
Yeah.
You know? And so I feel like this whole chapter, especially when I read a line like that, it reminds me a lot of our life. And, you know, and just like Jen, I can't wait to spend the rest of my life in wedded bliss as well with you, Charlene.
Right. We have a long honeymoon period, I think, for our marriage.
Still going on. Now, I know we joke about how many times we chose the same quote. There was a part of me that was kind of hoping you might have pulled this same one, but I'm going to guess perhaps you didn't.
Well, I mean, it's obviously a fantastic quote and very romantic of Mr. Rochester and my husband to say that, but I did pick a different one. This is something that Jane says, you know, kind of wrapping up her comments on her marriage, and I think it's a very beautiful kind of expression of, you know, what their marriage is like. So she says, I know what it is to live entirely for and with what I love best on earth. I hold myself supremely blessed, blessed beyond what language can express, because I am my husband's life as fully as he is mine. No woman was ever nearer to her mate than I am, ever more absolutely bone of his bone and flesh of his flesh. I know no weariness of my Edward's society, he knows none of mine, any more than we do of the pulsation of the heart that beats in our separate bosoms. Consequently, we are ever together.
Yeah, I mean, that's another classic one. That's another one of the ones where I had to stop and gather myself after
process
I read it.
Right? Yeah. Just the beauty of the fact that their connection is so strong, and even after the 10 years, you know, of marriage, that she still feels that way, and that they. I love that part that they are consequently ever together. That they are just they're so much in accord, and I feel like there is a faction of Jane Eyre fans that lament that Jane's happily ever after is as mundane as, you know, domestic marriage to Rochester.
Taking care of him.
Right. Yeah. And I just feel like with this passage, you know, how can anyone doubt her happiness when, you know, she just has everything she wanted? Some women, you know, they really thrive on a strong relationship with, you know, their husband and the family, and that brings strength to Jane after all that she has been through. And it's beautifully said.
Oh yeah, for sure. That's, I mean, I guess we can't keep gushing over this. It's a great book. It really is, and it ends in a very satisfying and romantic way.
Yes. So, you know, we've discussed this novel at length throughout our podcast, but there have been a lot of famous people who have been touched by Jane's story, and I wanted to comment on my favorite quote by a very famous author about Jane Eyre, and I feel like it's very apt, and another reason why this book resonates so strongly with me. This is a quote from Virginia Woolf on the experience of reading Jane Eyre. And this is from something she wrote called The Common Reader in the chapter titled Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. She wrote this in 1925. So she says, so intense is our absorption that if someone moves in the room, the movement seems to take place not there but up in Yorkshire. The writer has us by the hand, forces us along her road and makes us see what she sees, never leaves us for a moment or allows us to forget her. At the end, we are steeped through and through with the genius, the vehemence, the indignation of Charlotte Bronte. Remarkable faces, figures of strong outline and gnarled feature have flashed upon us in passing, but it is through her eyes that we have seen them. Once she is gone, we seek for them in vain. Think of Rochester, and we have to think of Jane Eyre. Think of the moor, and again there is Jane Eyre. Think of the drawing room, even those white carpets on which seem laid brilliant garlands of flowers, and that pale Parian mantelpiece with its bohemia glass of ruby red and the general blending of snow and fire. What is all that except Jane Eyre? And yeah, a very apt description of the experience of reading it, how absorbing it is, and just, you know, Jane's world feels so real and passionate and exciting.
Okay.
And that's what I hope that we have brought that throughout our podcast, that enthusiasm we have for the story and for Jane.
For sure. I mean, like I said, we talked about it. You referenced Jane Eyre on our first date. Mm-hmm. And all this many years later, it was still part of our lives. You know, we've been to the Bronte parsonage. Mm-hmm. We spent some time over there. We've we made friends. You still run a Facebook group.
Yeah.
You know, there's definitely this connection with this book and how meaningful it is, and I can understand that. As I've read it again, I'm starting to get a feel for why you like it so much, if I didn't already know. Yeah.
Yeah. So I guess I wanted to ask you, Mike, how and why is Jane's story meaningful to you?
Well, in a way, she has led a very fascinating life. I think I may have talked about it, but I moved around a lot as a kid. My father was in the military, and so I was always the new kid in school, but we were never in need. Military families have everything provided for them. And so it was interesting to read the tale of a person who had led such a completely different life than my own. I love movies that are set in a time period that's not present, in a specific spot. Like, you show me a movie that's set at a all boys Catholic school in the 50s, like Dead Poets Society or something like that, where you're like, I can't be there.
Yeah.
I can physically go to the place where they filmed it, but I can't be in that time period. And so I like that this was, again, it was written in the mid 19th century, takes place in the early 19th century, right? Mm-hmm. Is that what they said? So I am transported in a way. And I think that's where it I feel it's meaningful in that regard, and I said, we saw the Moors, we went to the Bronte parsonage, and going there was so rewarding and makes me want to go back there, maybe even retire there.
Oh, wow.
And then I feel like when you add in the parallels to our marriage, when I read this book, it grabs me that much more from an emotional standpoint. I'm so glad that we revisited this book when we did, because the first time I read it was, just after we met. Mm-hmm. I like to think of that as the Thornfield era.
Oh.
I did have a relative living in our house with us at the same time.
Yes.
Not a wife in the attic. It was a sister.
Wasn't a secret. Yeah.
Yeah. It was just my sister, and then when my sister moved away, and then we've now been just living us alone for 4 years now. Mm-hmm. And I feel like this second reading that I've done was just as we were buying a house and beginning the rest of our lives, which is kind of like the Ferndean era.
Oh, very neatly done.
And so it also gives me that much more insight into you and a lot of your interests and personality traits. Like I've talked about it before, like the stuff that you see in Rochester, or the stuff that Jane sees in Rochester. I'm guessing that's what you see in me, because anytime you enter in a relationship, you always find yourself asking, like, am I good enough? What does this other person see in me? Because when I've gone through my life being so unlucky in love, and when I finally found you and how blessed and how lucky I was to find you, that I read this book and I'm like, okay, now I understand a little bit more of why she does like me. I'm not handsome. I'm this dorky guy, and it's like,
no, I don't know about that.
I feel like it's taken me 5 years, since I read the book the first time to kind of recognize these things, because I didn't notice it the first time. I was just kind of blowing through and reading it, and so we had a conversation piece. But now that I know how important this book is to you, it's very enlightening to read this again from the perspective of Charlene as Jane. Because I feel like I could never be Mr. Darcy, but I could probably be Mr. Rochester.
Oh, okay.
Right?
Well, I sometimes joke that you're not Mr. Rochester because, Mr. Rochester, he has his issues, and I think that you're much more lighthearted, more fun probably to be around. Mr. Rochester can be a little sarcastic, but I feel...
I would never be that.
But I feel like the emotional connection is the same, and that's something that, you read something like Jane Eyre, you read any romance novel, and you think, oh, that's just idealized, or it's just, something that it's like a fantasy, right?
Yeah.
But it's nice to know that there are some things, especially in Jane Eyre, the emotional connection, the heart of it, that it can translate to real life, and that Charlotte, whether or not she actually experienced a lot of this, emotionally, that she was able to transcribe it and to pass that along to readers, which, is very moving. And I'm glad that you were able to pick up on that and appreciate that too.
Yeah, it's love in simple terms, right? Mm-hmm. It's not this sort of epic romance where he's like sweeping her off her feet with all this stuff. It's a very small, intimate tale about these two people in this one location.
Yes.
And I feel like that's where, again, why it has stood the test of time is that I feel like that's something you and I could do. That's something that the person at home could do. Yeah. They could find their Rochester
Yes.
Without, because there's a lot of Rochesters out there. Like you said, we have our flaws, and then you can talk about, you're being too modest to me.
Well, we all have our flaws.
Yeah,
that's for sure.
But I feel like we joke about it. This is the last mall other than name Jane Austen, but it seems like when you think about those as being these romantic heroes versus the Byronic hero, which is someone that you're like, I maybe can relate to them.
Yeah, because they're a little flawed.
Yeah, exactly.
So as we're coming to the close of this episode, we did start this podcast on October 6th of 2021. And now we're coming to the last episode, which is September 14th, 2022. And I just wanted to say that we started this because I felt there was a void in Jane Eyre podcast that, dive deep into the story and view it on its own terms as a reader would, and not just as an academic or through literary analysis. And my goal was not to critically overhaul the story, but to celebrate it and talk about all the things I love about it. And it's bittersweet to come to the end of our discussions of the novel, but looking back, I am so happy with this accomplishment. This is something I can come back to in the future when I feel like revisiting my thoughts on the book, and I hope it gives entertainment to other Jane Eyre fans for a long time to come. So as the original purpose for the podcast comes to an end, I think we're not quite ready to say goodbye, so Mike and I do plan to continue to podcast about other aspects of Jane Eyre, like adaptations and book retellings and other random ideas we have, but not on a regular basis.
Jane Eyre sequel.
And so future podcast episodes will be sporadic, but hopefully if you are a subscriber to the show, you'll stay subscribed so you'll be notified when new episodes drop. Thank you so much to everyone listening and to the people who have talked to us online because they enjoy the show. Your comments and engagement mean the world to us, especially for me to know that you love Jane Eyre as much as I do.
I married him. I hold myself supremely blessed because I am my husband's life as fully as he is mine. Mr. Rochester continued blind the first 2 years of our union, but gradually the obscurity clouding his left eye cleared. The sky is no longer a blank to him. The earth no longer a void. God has tempered judgment with mercy.
If you enjoyed our podcast, please subscribe and leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. This really helps us grow and reach new listeners. If you want to talk Jane Eyre with me online, you can find me on Twitter and Instagram at EyreGuide. That's EYRE.
And if you want to hear more from me, I host my own podcast called Out of Touchstone, where my good friend Chad and I discuss all the films that Disney produced for their Touchstone Pictures label. You can also find me on Twitter at Mike DeKalb.
Thank you, and farewell for the present.